questions, queries? No one's screamed or shouted so far. God, was it so dull that none of it made you question what I was saying?
Yes, just digesting a little bit.
One question. All those savings, do they generate like revenue or interest somewhere, or do they just keep the money for safekeeping?
There's quite small interest. But remember, these are quite small sums.
Yeah, but they don't just keep the money, they place them somewhere.
Oh, no, the money is well used. The money is constantly being loaned and returned, So it's cycling very fast the whole time.
I was wondering about the land. Do they own it in the end? Who owns the land that they build?
In the end, you negotiate for two things. You negotiate for land where you can build, and then that becomes your land. Or you negotiate for upgrading your settlement, where what you're negotiating is the right to have tenure for the plot on which you are. So yes, you are negotiating for tenure. One of the reasons that they use community toilets is that community toilets can deliver services without the need for tenure. You know, tenure is the ideal, but in 90% of circumstances they can't get that therefore you look for ways of improving conditions, but don't rely on you having tenure.
What's tenure?
The right to be on that plot and to sell it. Ownership is
yeah. But there are communities that doesn't have tenure.
Yes. Well, as you get to more and more stories, so it becomes more complicated. In Thailand, for instance, we are a community where on an illegal plot of land illegally, we negotiate with the landowner to buy it. He says no, she says no. Though you negotiate a 10-year renewable lease. So there's, between formal tenure and ownership and no tenure and ownership, there's all sorts of intermediary steps, and you negotiate as far up the scale as you can.
I was wondering, this is how it looks right now, but looking into the future, are these just temporary settlements and these different tenures and stuff? Like, if you look into the future in 20 years, will it work that these informal settlements exist, or will they have to move out of the cities and
Already they're building places that you and I would like to live in.
okay.
It takes a long time, not all of them can do so, but no, they're building very nice quality houses. Some of them in Thailand are gorgeous. The difficulty in Thailand is they've got such gorgeous housing, the middle class are desperate to buy in. And one of the difficulties is stopping them doing it. Interesting what they did there, which is a good response to your question, is that they had community tenure, not individual tenure, which is what protected them from people selling out speculatively to get money from middle class coming in. So if you have a 30th of the lease of the plot we're in, if you need to move out, we'll give you what you spent on your house, but you won't get the market value.
Right. Because we were reading about like these communities in Egypt, and the poor population built homes, but they didn't have ownership. Yeah, ownership of the land. So the state could just go in and remove the houses. Do they have some kind of insurance? Or,
There's two things to consider. One is the formal procedures, which is getting them tenure, which gives them a legal defence against eviction. The other is government attitudes that accept the right to be there. And sometimes that second one is more important than the first. In Buenos Aires, where I go every year, there's many settlements that don't have tenure, but it is politically inconceivable that they would be bulldozed at the moment. You never quite trust the current Argentine government, but at the moment it's inconceivable that they're bulldozed.
I was wondering about those informal settlements on payments. Are they paying any rent for living there, or just building? And when they improve those settlements, does the rent kick in, or does it just continue to be free for them to live there?
The pavement dwellers want to move. They don't want to stay in their pavement
Okay.
dwellings. So when they move to other housing that they design and build themselves, yes, they pay rent. If you're on the pavement, you may be paying quite high prices for electricity and for water from the shop owner who's just next door.
Okay.
So your costs may be high, but you aren't actually paying rent.
Okay.
Well, you're asking us upgrading initiatives of these pavement dwellings.
Yeah, if they upgrade the actual housing in the pavements,
You can't.
they don't.
It's this size. And you've got a major road here.
Yes, but if they upgrade with size, not with size, but with other commodities or better electricity or pipelines,
They want to move.
they want to move.
The funny thing is that it's a good example, actually, of NGOs getting it wrong. There was a big NGO movement to give the pavement dwellers the right to live on the pavement. And it went through. There was a formal Supreme Court ruling, and no one asked the pavement dwellers, we don't want to live on the pavement. Don't give us the right to live on the pavements. Give us the right to live in a decent house.
So it is just temporary in that way.
Well,
Like-
some of them have been there 30 years.
Right, but like those people who live in these communities or something, their goal is to get away from it?
Their goal is to get a proper house, yes.
Yes, okay.
But it depends on what we're talking about. I mean, some people sort of, their identities have been invested in that plot, in the area. They have the social networks there. And so it's different talking about the pavement dwellers from talking from informal settlements that have been there for
Absolutely.
50 years, you know. So it's...
Absolutely.
I think one of the things you were saying is very important is community tenure, as differing from individual tenure to a plot, because even if you get the legal right, if you have an individual property tenure, and if you're poor, you can very easily be bought off, right? I mean, you need to afford to be still on your land. I mean, if somebody's coming with lots of money, it will just, buy you out and you will be displaced too. So there's kind of forced displacements in some cases, but also market-driven displacements, which has to do with the value of the land and what you can afford and all that.
And very nice houses built.
Well, I wonder is there like a house market? Do they sell their houses
Oh, yes.
to each other?
Oh, yes. There's a complex real estate market and almost all informal settlements.
Right, and also you see like a trend of gentrification that maybe become up new communities that would be even poorer.
What you're aiming for, it's a good question, what you're aiming for is a scale of upgrading,
Yeah.
but doesn't mean you privilege small amounts of the housing stock. The genius of this program in Thailand is that it had such a large scale that it wasn't just creating beautiful, cheap housing here, it was creating it all over the city. And I think that's the only way to cope with this. You've got to go to an enormous scale. Otherwise, if you've got nice upgrading schemes producing nice quality housing, they'll end up legally or illegally being sold. Interestingly, the women pavement dwellers, when they moved to a new house they designed, they chose toilets shared between 4 households to stop middle class coming in. Very clever. The middle class do not want to come in and share their toilets with 3 other households.
I'm going to share a little bit here. Can we take 2 questions and then we will go away and move on to the next? There.
Oh, thanks. I was thinking about the future. Do you have an optimistic view of the future? I mean, aren't the numbers of slum dwellers growing a lot? And was it like 1 billion people living in these areas? I mean, is the areas that get, I don't know, what you say, upgraded and developed? Is that speed? Is it a lot? I don't know how to say. Is it too slow for compared to the other speed of
Informal.
Yeah, will it be possible to help all the slum dwellers around the world, or I don't know? Do you have an optimistic view?
I
Can you take another question?
got 2 hats.
Can you take another
Sure.
question? There was another hand. Yeah. You?
No, there's nothing.
All right, you take
At the same time?
Yeah, and then you can answer both questions.
Okay. Well, different note. You mentioned that a way for these organizations to gain legitimacy with the local government was to make them see them as parts of the local economy. But what about the people that are apart from this local economy that aren't working or that are sick. And I'm thinking about perhaps the rural populations. That's nothing to do with the urban situation, but minorities and native peoples, and where do they fit in when they're not contributing to this local economy? How can they be seen as important? Because then there are other values at play than just the economic drive.
Okay, I got two hats. On the IPCC, we're stuffed. The future is bleak and horrible and terrible, and we've got no chance of change. On the Federation side, I've seen such fantastic progress in the last 20 years that I got optimism. And what I didn't speak about is in Latin America, the very strong citizen movement, return to democracy, change the constitutions, decentralize real power to city governments. And I could mention 20 city governments where things have improved dramatically for low-income groups in 15 years. Dramatically. You've had an enormous decline in the proportion living in formal settlements because formal settlements were available. Enormous increase in the population with water piped to their home, sewers, drains, access to healthcare. And you've got a few examples of that in Thailand, as I mentioned. India, the policy being promoted by the government of India has changed fundamentally in the last 10 years. It hasn't worked its way down to state and city government yet. So yes, with the second hat on, I have some optimism. On the point about those who are excluded, it's a good question. The women's savings groups are the means by which everyone gets pulled into inclusion. And the Federation's commitment is that what they do is relevant to all their members, not just to the wealthier 30 to 40%. And you'll find that many so-called marginal groups, for instance, Muslims living in Hindu parts of Mumbai, form saving groups more quickly because it gives them a solidarity in the group. And it's through that daily savings mechanisms that you pull in the poorest groups, the most marginal groups. It's actually very difficult in the federations to manage this because in the Kenyan Federation, for instance, you've got 150,000 savers. Some of those are close to affording reasonable formal solutions. Others have no chance of doing so. Eventually, it will take national government policy to provide the safety nets. The federations can't provide the safety nets. They haven't got the resources to do so for poorest groups. I suppose here, where I'm optimistic is that the conditional cash transfer is now seen as legitimate as a development intervention, and you're getting its widespread application even in Africa. And that should be providing the minimal income for those that have no other way of getting it.
I have a couple of questions, since there's no hand in the air now. And this data that the communities collect, so who becomes the repository of that material, and how can they control access? Because you said that they, now it's the communities that own the data, and I'm thinking about where governments might possibly make less, unanticipated uses of the data, say for taxing people or things like that.
Well, the technical management of the data is done by local NGOs. Always with complete open access and decision by the communities as to who can use it and how they can use it. A lot of researchers have actually gone to the federations wanting to use their data, and mostly have been refused the right to do so. The federations don't feel that this is appropriate for the data they collect.
Are you talking about NGOs as different from the community-based organizations?
Yes. So that in South Africa, you've got the Federation of the Urban Poor, and you've got the Community Organisation Resource Centre. And it's the Community Organisation Resource Centre that has all the data, keeps all the data from the enumerations and the mapping. In Kenya, you have 2 NGOs that manage all the data collected by the federations.
And I suppose they also have some of this know-how, like the GPS
Yes.
technique and all of
Yes.
that, right?
Yes, it's usually the NGOs that incorporate all the social economic data into the GIS systems.
So I think an important comment here is actually how it is not just the achievement of the poor and the illiterate, but it actually needs some kind of some know-how coming in
Yes.
in some way. Yeah.
Yes. Well, the federations can't negotiate with European funding agencies.
I mean, you talk about like a process of formalization, but isn't there a danger that, I mean, together with formalization also comes corruption? Because you have leaders eventually, and you're talking about then adjusting to sort of our way of thinking and doing things in a sense. And how do you think,
Okay, you got the formal rules and regulations. 300 square metre minimum plot sizes. You have to be connected to a pipe water supply, sewers, and 8-metre roads to be a formal plot. Here you have the informal settlements where there's no pipe water, no sewers, no drains, no roads, no standards. What the Federation is trying to do is to find something here that becomes formal. So formal then becomes this continuum between what I stated and here, where it's community infrastructure and community toilets and smaller plots. It's important to have this formalised, because that's your only defence against eviction, and it's your only possibility of getting government-funded infrastructure. So I see the federations as negotiating the formal on their terms, rather than the state increasing its formal coverage. In the end, even if this standard here is too much for 30% of the federations then will still continue building and doing stuff outside of that. But it just sets a benchmark that many of them can actually meet. And you know, it's funny, I've been going to Zimbabwe many times, and you know, there's some settlements you go where you feel the insecurity and the worry, and you talk to the Federation members there, and the police have come in and smashed their informal markets and turned off their water taps. And you go to others where it's formal, where they're building, their kids are in the local schools, they get a decent water supply, they can go to city government and make demands on them because they're a formal settlement. And that's an important shift. It does bring worrying cost implications sometimes. You know, you move from a lousy source of water for which you pay nothing to a very good source of water, but you're expected to pay a monthly bill. That's difficult for some federation members.
If there is a formal community, can you move into that community if you're not like a citizen and if you don't have a community? So if, when the community has become formal, can a citizen that's not like doesn't have to take risks move into the formal
No, the Federation savings groups manage, once you've got land, who it's allocated to, and it's done through a process of consensus building across the whole Federation. Because, you know, nothing is more dangerous than giving a grassroots organisation a resource that will benefit 20% of their members. So this has to be managed very carefully. Again, you know, it sounds crazy, but these women's savings groups, they manage so many of these issues on a day-to-day basis.
So new immigrants can move into...
Yes, anyone can join the Federation. Anyone can join the Federation. And Federation members go to informal settlements all the time to talk about the Federation and the savings groups and how it helps them.
May I ask a troublesome question? In my own research, although I don't do research on that particular issue, but I meet a lot of people who sort of, you know, have gone on the microcredit way, or even are parts of local savings groups, or have been, but are no longer, because they simply cannot afford to make those daily savings, or you know, and that might be a way of actually excluding lots of people from being part of these initiatives. What's your experience on that?
There's no minimum savings. There's no requirement for you to save a certain amount. And you save at the pace that is possible for you. Now, obviously, if you want to draw loans, you have to have more in your savings, but savings, there is no requirement. The other thing that is absolutely critical, microfinance is my relationship with you as an entrepreneur that need a loan. In the federation model, my relationship is with everyone in this room who gets a plot of land through what we've done. It's funding for collective endeavours, not funding for individual endeavours. I think those are the two reasons why it has importance beyond microfinance.
Okay, I just, if you still have some patience, I'd like just to pick your brain a little bit on a couple of things that you have very wide experience. And actually one question before you move into that, and that is, you had in your blog a comment about the 6th World Urban Forum. And you put this difficult question about, will the grassroots organizations of the urban forum, will they ever be able to influence the research agenda or the development agenda? Will they ever be heard? Do you want to tell us a little bit about the impressions from the World Urban Forum in that respect?
Did any of you go to the World Urban Forum? Because every 2 years this is organised by UN Habitat, and it's meant to be I don't know, 10, 11, 12, 13,000 people go to it. So it's a big event, and it's meant to be a discussion of innovation and change. And none of the grassroots organisations were invited. The government set up, the UN Habitat set up this program. Lots of mayors, lots of local governments, lots of national governments, lots of international agencies. But a World Urban Forum didn't have any representative organisations of the very people that legitimated the whole thing. UN Habitat exists to address urban poverty. The World Bank exists to address poverty. CEDA exists to address poverty. And yet, if they have no dialogue, no discussion, they don't even talk to low-income groups in their community organisations. And I get very pissed off because there are representative organisations that can negotiate on behalf of the Urban Forum. The amazing thing about the World Urban Forum is that the federations manage to book spaces and to come themselves and to make presentations. And you've got this fantastic contrast. I was asked to chair one of the formal sessions for the United Nations in a hall with 1,500 seats, and there were 80 people there looking bored. And I went to 3 of the Federation presentations, which were in small peripheral halls with only 150 seats, and there was 300 people in each of them. So it wasn't as if there wasn't an interest in the forum. It's just the complete failure of so many official agencies to actually recognise the need to engage low-income groups themselves. That's
Important point, maybe. But now on something totally else. You've been contributing to the assessments of the intergovernmental panel on climate change, and we're just curious. I'm curious about how, what's your, if you could tell us something about that experience of being part of that process.
How long have you got?
No, it's just okay, 3 minutes.
You all know what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is? Yeah? The main difficulty for me is I was pulled into the Intergovernmental Panel in 1997. And in 1997 it was full of climate scientists. Very good climate scientists. But they saw the IPCC then as giving information to governments about climate science and about what climate's going to do. Not who climate change is going to impact. Not who is most at risk, who is most vulnerable to climate change. So in the 4th assessment, a few social scientists like myself kind of crept into the IPCC, and we began to engage with the climate scientists. And it's quite a difficult dialogue because they are superb professionals in their own field, but they don't see informal settlements. By the 5th assessment, which is happening now, you won't have read any of its publications because none have been released yet. There is now a recognition that not only must we understand how climate is changing, but who's going to be impacted, what crops are going to be impacted, whose water is going to be lost, who's going to suffer more serious floods, who's going to suffer more serious drugs, and build that into the discussion. And that's where we are at the moment. In the third assessment, we kind of assumed that government would take action, and so you would stop this growth in greenhouse gas emissions and push it down like that. By the fourth assessment, we began to realize the government weren't coming up with that agreement. So how you cope with climate change then becomes more important. By the fifth assessment, we know that the world is going to have to deal with dangerous climate change, because we're just not getting government agreements. So the importance of adaptation to climate change and building resilience and reducing vulnerability becomes important. So as we get further and further along the failure of governments to agree on emission reduction, so dealing with climate change becomes more and more important, and that then brings in people like myself more than the climate scientists.
Do you have a question on this? It's like opening a can of worms. Any question?
Will there be equal problematics in dealing with climate change, just trying to prevent climate change?
Is it
the governments have to agree on some kind of action plan.
Yes.
When this climate change occurs, when they couldn't agree on, action before it happened, and now they're going to try to agree on action when it is happening. Do you think it's going to be easier to deal with it now than it was to prevent it?
No, the best form of adaptation is prevention. If the curve of average temperatures, if the curve of greenhouse gas emissions keeps rising, we know that we're in for dangerous climate change. 2040, 2050, 2060, we're not quite sure when. But we know that it's going to produce catastrophic impacts on the global economy. It just took those floods in Thailand for suddenly everyone to realize how much their factory relied on inputs from what was made in Bangkok. Now, you can imagine floods in Bangkok multiplied by 3 in intensity, multiplied by 20 in their frequency. And you begin to get a sense of how much the whole world will be disrupted by climate change. What we're hoping is that governments seem to take action when the IPCC produces a new assessment. So when the fourth assessment was produced, governments began to take adaptation seriously. What we're hoping is that when the fifth assessment's findings are presented, and they're even more pessimistic than the fourth assessment, that will be the catalyst for governments to take action. My cynical side says no government is going to take action on something that is to protect the future against the present. I just hope I'm wrong.
I have a strange question maybe, but if you had all the money in the world, kind of.
Rock and roll, a guitar. I want Eric Clapton's.
But when it has to do with climate and not music. No, but do you think it's most important to invest in solutions to prevent climate change? Like, okay, if you had all the money, that's maybe not fair. Let's say you had some of the money. But what's most important for us now? To invest in preventing climate change, or to also invest in coming up with solutions to how we should adapt to climate change?
Both. You can't separate the two. You can't separate the two. And I'm often asked by, what's the priority in adaptation for cities? The priority is work with the federations, put in slum upgrading, put in sewers, put in drains, put in a decent healthcare system, emergency services, a garbage collection system. You can't have drains that work if you haven't got a garbage collection system. All those are development. But all those build the capacity to do the things that you need for climate change. At the moment, there's this separation. There's adapting to climate change and there's development. It's insane. The two have to be melded together. And what we're doing in our chapter is we're saying that basically cities have to go through 3 transformations. The first is the development transformation. And you can see many cities in Latin America that have done that. The adaptation and resilience transformation, which is where you build on what you've achieved in development to build resilience to the unexpected. The killer about climate change is that we don't know what changes it's going to produce at the local level. If we knew that storms are going to increase in frequency steadily, in a sense you can build that into what you're doing. What we've got to do is we've got to build cities that are resilient to unexpected changes. The third transformation is achieving development and adaptation and resilience with lower greenhouse gas emissions. There's some cities have moved in each of those transformations, but none has done so comprehensively.
Where would you put the government failure in a way? Is it in the lowering the gas emissions due to needs in urban systems, especially in Western societies and Northern societies, or would it be in the promoting of DTAs, gas technologies available, in investments in the South and in the developing situations?
What underpins climate change is high consumption. So if what you're doing isn't dealing directly or indirectly with high consumption, you're not dealing with it.
Word.
Word. so maybe the rock and roll guitar is out too.
But if you take a Clapton, you won't buy a new one.
That's true. Thank you. I
Continue.
But and how much of the world's money are you giving me for this?
40%.
Oh, that's good enough. It was quite funny because I got awarded the Volvo Environment Prize, and I told them that I was going to buy an electric guitar with the prize money, and they were very upset. They didn't think that was environmental at all.
You should have said it would be secondhand or a used one.
Exactly, I should have done.
There was another arm in the air.
I was thinking, you were talking about how international corporations will sort of move their place of production away from environmentally hostile places, so to speak.
Yeah.
Will that then reverse the effects that globalization is having on the economy, with jobs being brought back into, say, Western Europe, for example? And will that then make us stop caring again about what's happening in the South?
It's an interesting question. I don't know. If you're in Mumbai and you're threatened with sea level rise and with extreme precipitation, it's much simpler to move to Pune, the city 3 hours away, which is protected from those environmental risks. Whether as more and more disruption happens, we'll get a retrenchment back to the well-run cities, I don't know. I think it's an important question to think about. What scares me a little is that capital and wealthy people can move in response to changing risks and opportunities. Most low-income groups can't. And most people in Mumbai with low incomes, their social capital, their friends, their culture, their family, their survival networks are all located in Mumbai. They can't just move to Pune. The scary thing is that that's one of the really difficult aspects of resilience to deal with, that the rich can move, the poor can't.
Do you have any solutions to this, this high consumerism thing that we, live right now? Everything is about consume, the economy and everything. Like, how can I change it? Is it possible for us living right now to change this way?
It is. What's amazing is you look at cities and you look at the emissions coming from cities. For the nicest cities in the world, there's a tenfold difference in emissions per person. Tenfold difference in emissions per person. So you go to a city like Porto Alegre, Oslo, 2 tons carbon emissions per person per year. Now that's very respectable, especially since many US cities, it's 30 tons carbon emissions per person per year. Go to Porto Alegre, my favorite city in Latin America. Gorgeous city, participatory budgeting, innovative, good quality life. 1.5 tons of carbon emissions per person per year. We know that cities can provide very high qualities of life with much reduced emissions, but they need to change. They have to have a good public transport system. They can't be low-density sprawl on the suburbs. And people have to commit themselves to going less on holidays abroad and more on holidays locally. We can conceive a very high quality of life with low emissions, but it will mean some constraints on what we choose to do.
But in the example of Oslo, isn't it because Norway is exporting their oil and importing electricity that makes them have low CO2 emissions?
It's because they get their electricity from hydro, mainly. But the point you raise is a good one, that cities are within a broader national and international context, and you can't just focus on the cities, you've got to focus on the bigger picture. Absolutely, yes. Also, I don't actually trust the government of Norway's figures for Oslo, but I haven't had a chance. What's Stockholm's average per capita emissions?
It's under that same threat.
Say it again?
It's under the same threat that you impose on now. That it's being misled. The number they present,
yeah,
it's wrong, and they know that they are now discussing where.
Yeah.
Well, they're fixing the number.
Well, one of the killers is that, okay, you take London, which is I know. Do you do emissions based on all the emissions in its boundaries? Or do you do it on the basis of the emissions generated by all Londoners' consumption? If you do it on the basis of emissions within London, it's quite low, 6 tonnes per person per year. Because we import all our electricity, so none of the electricity generation happens within London. If we do it on the basis of Londoners' consumption, it's 12 tonnes per person per year. And of course, we have to move to that consumption-based auditing, because that's the only one that deals with the problem that both of you raised.
It's about the footprints of cities, which is cannot be measured within the limits, the physical limits of the city, right? And that varies enormously worldwide, depending on what kind of city we're talking about. So those cities, like Stockholm, we have very low impact locally. We have a good quality of environmental life, but the footprint is. So if you go in and check the travel patterns of people within Marie Stad, which is a very renowned, sustainable neighborhood that has been built in Stockholm some years ago, you will see that those people travel perhaps more than most Stockholmers, or foreign, have the vacation in Thailand every year or something like that. And it's the practices also that matter, right? So.
Yeah, that's right.
Can I put one last question?
Sure.
It's not a small one, but you have like 3 minutes to. And it's about these MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, because I know there's, the part of the audience here has been discussing that quite a bit in their program. And by 2015, the world is supposed to have reached the Millennium Development Goals, and we know it's not going to happen for everyone. And you've been reflecting about these things yourself as well, that we need to, and indeed some people are thinking beyond 2015, what's going to come after, what's next, basically. You want to just give us a glimpse of your thinking in terms of the challenges and the opportunities beyond the 2015?
Well, I liked the MDGs because they forced attention to things that are important for low-income groups: infant mortality, child mortality, maternal mortality, education, healthcare, disease avoidance. So that, they were good. What was crazy is that some of the targets were only half. How can you have a target for, we're going to reduce by half the number of mothers that die, which means we allow the other half of mothers to die. We have to move to universal targets. It's got to be universal coverage for water, for sanitation, drainage, healthcare, schools. There's much better goals now being developed on infant, child and maternal mortality rates that reflect that commitment to universal provision. The other issue that scares me is that who does the implementation? I work a lot with local governments, and most of the MDGs depend on local governments acting. Most of the problems fall within their jurisdiction. But local government wasn't consulted about the MDGs. They didn't make commitment to the MDGs. National government made commitments when it was local government responsibilities, and this is crazy. The post-MDGs have to identify who's got to act to achieve the goal or the target, not just set the goal and the target as a national government thing. And I can tell you that, I won't give you a long talk of this, but the whole post-MDG thing is a mess. They've got a high-level panel that won't agree on anything. And it's all composed of national government people. It's got David Cameron, who's busy dismantling the welfare state of my own country, and then claiming to be an expert on post-2015. The whole thing is riveting. in craziness and paradoxes. We tried to introduce sustainable development in cities, and they took sustainable development in cities to mean sustainable economic growth, not lowering carbon emissions and so on and so on. So you've got a high-level panel with all their complexities and crazinesses. And then you've got all the UN agencies, each of whom have produced a separate paper on this. And then you've got the post-Rio Sustainable Development Goals. And then you've got the Busan process, which is where aid agencies made commitments to follow certain procedures. And none of them are talking to each other. And all of them are trying to set their own agendas. It's a mess. I do wish that Jacques Delors International is trying to get a recognition that they have the right to make some goals and targets too. And local governments are trying to make a position where they would take on commitments themselves and monitor themselves. And that would be a huge step forward. If the organisations responsible for implementation took on the targets and monitored them, rather than this always happening at national government level. Kind of a pity. It would be more fun to have heard what you think of the MDGs.
Any questions before we round up? There's plenty to think about, isn't it? Yeah. All right. So, thanks a million, David, for this wonderful afternoon, for a really insightful, broad and insightful picture.
No one fell asleep.
No, I don't think so. No one for that. And, for
My students fall asleep a lot, I have to say.
Well, if you get to meet you a few times, it happens to me also. Not to be proud of. So let's give David a hand.